Hello everyone, today we talk about the age of European expansion between the 11th and the 13th century. We already addressed the topic several times. Now we give some further detail, and we'll deal mostly with the demographic expansion, economical dynamics, and urbanization. That, as we have explained many times, basically is a pretty good picture of the surplus that these societies were a consequence of the surplus that the societies could produce. So this demographic growth, especially, consider here we're talking naturally about pre-industrial systems. The economy is overwhelmingly agricultural. So the demographic growth means a lot in terms, it largely overlaps also with the agricultural one, this time in terms of labor force of people that need to be fed. And there would be, at other times, actually, we discussed the causes of such growth. What was that? Were there environmental factors that played on human society, or it was the other way around? I tend to favor mostly the latter, orientatively speaking, but it was probably all things altogether. Climate change has been always paraded in last generations. Everything changes because of climate. Not only, but yes, we gotta give that structurally speaking, there is also enough evidence of this for this age of expansion. I don't have to repeat what you can find actually in the medieval society playlist, but an important part of this story is realizing how big not just this growth was, but practically what the system arrived to by the end of the 13th century. That's probably the true, the most stereotypical medieval civilization, right? What happens later after, first of all, the important crisis of the mid-14th century, for which Europe takes a while before it can grow once again. It will reach the same levels fundamentally by the 16th century. In the cities also, as you know, there are certain cities in Europe that didn't have the same amount of population pre-14th century levels up to the second modern age, or even the contemporary one. This is interesting. You can measure it even just by looking at the city rings and seeing how much it took for the cities, the modern contemporary cities, to refill it and to expand it, or to tear them down, fortunately, on certain occasions. And it's probably a medieval civilization about which we do not know this enormous much, right? We start paradoxically understanding better this system in the moment in which it enters in crisis. I personally study exactly, history of warfare in that very moment, in those 60 years between the 90s and of the 13th and the 40s of the 14th century, and that's definitely that gives you the dimension of also how this crisis triggers a further increase in quality, in intelligence, if you want, in application. But as far as the world existed before this is astonishing. Is the great world of cathedrals, these 80 monsters built here, never seen before, right? European history had never seen such a dramatic growth, historically speaking, right? It's really a big deal because it all happened from the within, right? There were important trade dynamics that we also highlighted in other videos, but we got to give that, Europeans will keep growing, surpassing these rates of growth, let's say, only in the modern age because of the resources taken from the outside through colonialism, right? And not just those ones, but fundamentally with an acceleration there, with a very different dynamic that we can see here now. We could go on, like pointing out the reasons of this, right? We discussed this at times. We made also comparisons with specifically Western Europe, so that what emerges from this broader Frankish Basilitic beneficiary system, in the post-Carolingian kingdoms, and that it expand eventually beyond. But this is that, for example, Constantinople or the Islamic world didn't quite transform in the same ways, right? And this is fundamental. We'll take a look better at this maybe on another time. Today we just give raw data and a bit of interpretation of the same. So this demographic growth has its first signals between the 9th and the 10th century. I would go as far as saying 8, especially in certain southern European regions. Exactly, in fact, the ones where money and trade were more intense. And this is quite important, chronologically speaking, because we have often say, this is the growth, the revival of the year 1000. But actually, historiographically speaking, we have at this point come to the realization that what we see by the year 1000, it's something that had already, that was blooming because of a previous growth and structuring that in the previous centuries. And that's pretty evident in a way. What we can say, though, is that the 11th century saw, and especially more as we'll see the 12th, a strengthening, a consolidation, right, in the 3 following centuries, let's say. This between the 11th, in fact, and the 13th, with particularly accelerated, trend during the 12th. And a bit slowing down in the second half of the 13th century. So, talking of the population of the European West, so here we're speaking essentially of Germany, the Danubian area, Great Britain, the Netherlands, France, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula, where in fact the demographic growth was stronger than in the rest actually of Europe and the Mediterranean, would reach the 70 million inhabitants. 70 million inhabitants. Starting from a base of 25 millions. Do you realize what this means, right? That this is almost triple in 300 years. It's something astonishing. And that's really what gives you the dimension of this massive growth. It's something really incredible. I don't know whether there are other historical cases of such, that can be compared quantitatively speaking to this. And this is also one of the reasons why I think that really the base of what we consider also as, Western civilization holds a lot from a structural point of view to this very moment. Right, because the genetics was there in terms of culture, philosophies, of certain mindset, and so on. But before this, large parts of Europe were fundamentally backwards, especially the ones that here grew in relative terms the greatest, the ones in Northern Europe. Right, the wealth, historically, the advancement had all concentrated in the Mediterranean. What happens in here, especially from the Central European dimension specifically, and this is interesting because it starts from not just from the coast, but specifically from the hinterland, right? It's a process that has properly a European continental dimension. Is utterly astonishing, to say the least. And here we have the data, in particular, Italy would pass, at least, these are estimates broadly meant, but this is what we see, from 5 to 12, 13 million inhabitants, right? England from 2 to 6 millions. France from 6 to more than 20 millions. France from 6 millions to more than 20, right? This is embarrassing. Germany, even more, right? At least the Germany of the modern boundaries or of the modern country that were smaller naturally than at what was Germany at the time, broadly meant, from 3 to 4 millions up to 12 to 15 millions. Right? If we look at these estimates, we have from 3 to 5 times more in 300 years. This is embarrassing. There are no other ways to point it out. And this also gives you an important dimension of other things. Today I was reading this data, and honestly, I didn't know, because I've never gotten particularly interested in demographics and this kind of bit structuralist and positivistic idea of can fundamentally point out everything through numbers and so on. But if you read this stuff, even though they are estimates, but they're fairly reliable, here you understand a lot about even just the politics and the history of these countries. Right, these, especially here, Italy, Germany, and France, are pretty down. I mean, this is objectively where most things take place at the time. And some of the most astonishing changes. I mean, you can't understand what the Carpathian Kingdom was if you don't read this datum from 6 million to 20 million inhabitants. You can't understand the Italian communal civilization if you don't understand from the 5th to the 12th, 13 millions. You can understand even the Germanic expansion and how, even from a military point of view, this system began by the end, in fact, of the 13th century to produce so many mercenaries, to many people that went abroad. So a huge amount, right? Here, Germany almost, it surpasses Italy, and it almost reaches the same numbers of France, right? It arrives at the same level, even surpasses Italy, and, comes close, at least, to the same French population, which is astonishing. Also considering that was a smaller country, extensionally speaking, and also in the previous centuries hadn't been this great much in terms of productivity and so on. So this is really important, and this naturally could be extended also for the Danubian, especially the Upper Danube, the Middle Danube, also Spain, the Iberian Peninsula as a whole. And looking at the data of population density, we here see in France 20 inhabitants per square kilometer, from 12 to 15 in England, around 10 in Germany, and in Italy, thanks to this thickest urban net, they would reach, on average, 14 inhabitants per square kilometer, right? Consider that Italy is still the European country with the highest demographic density. Also because it's smaller, extensionally speaking, and most it's mountains. So consider how many people were concentrating there, right? And this was also the richest area per capita. So it gives you an astonishing measure of this growth that is utterly insane. All the wealth that was capitalized in here, intercontinental trade is astonishing, right? Here there are lots of external factors we can't ignore that are associated to, it can be seen as both causes and consequences of the crisis of the end of the 13th and up to the big one of the mid 14th century. But this is mostly an all European phenomenon, right? Something that really starts from the humus of this continent and its western, let's say, Frankicized part. So here, consider about Italy still, the fact that was a very important difference between the two parts of the peninsula, because the center and north were strongly urbanized, right? It has intensively cultivated campaigns, while the south and the Great Islands had lower levels of population. And we'll take better look, however, about this because it was still high by European average, and later, especially talking about urbanism, we'll give more data about this region. So beyond the absolute value of numbers that are naturally based, as we were saying, on hypothetical calculations, and over which there is not much of an agreement also from the side of the historians, right, that have, as far as I know, I have a very poor idea of what it is, because this stuff has usually always bored me if I had to research it myself. But it's because of methodological problems that I don't know how I could handle, frankly. And this is the result, in fact, that there's not much consensus, right? Everybody thinks a bit the same thing, especially as far as economics is concerned. There are probably the wildest differences in all medieval historiography, possibly. However, there is one, common ground which we all agree is that there was a dramatically great population growth. Right, this is clear by all. And there are, in fact, precise signals about this. That is the put into culture new lands, the multiplication of settlements, the development of a thick also parish net. That is very important as far, especially as the sedentary, the permanent territorial structures are concerned. Right here, there is all a process of properly civilization. Many areas, especially towards the northeast, that had never seen a proper urbanization, for example, historically. So there is a broad and literally an extension of this system. Geographically speaking, this Europe expands into other areas, right, of Europe and Mediterranean. Another very famous indicator, as far as we were saying also before, looking at the enlarging or even the construction of multiple rings of city walls, right? That sometimes, usually, most European cities were essentially of Roman foundation. So you see here, this medievals start, using the same city ring most of them. They build another one, sometimes even an outer one again, right? So it's something impressive extensionally speaking. So let's try to spot the causes of the phenomenon and of reconstructing in its various phases. So the demographic revival started definitely from the dissolution of certain destabilizing factors that had an important dimension between the 4th and 7th century. There would be to debate about this now. We'll see maybe something more we can say. So starting from the mid 8th century, for example, there is no news, no mentioning of the plague in the European West, right? That is important because, as you know, especially by the 6th century, whatever this was, whether it was a smallpox epidemic, whatever, that there had been a major pandemic that had simply had a dramatic impact on the broader demographic and economical scale of Europe, and not all. The medical treatises written between the 9th and 12th century actually do not talk about it. This illness seemed to come to be circumscribed to certain centers, endemic centers, let's say in Africa and in Asia, but Europe is still out of it. Famines also do not have those, general, broader dimensions, and they mostly hit in more local, regional realities. This has also to do with this tumultuous growth that naturally creates certain structural failures here and there, and naturally the more there is here, the more the thing becomes unstable in a way. It keeps growing, and that's also why all the big crises at the end of this period, because there were no structures to absorb the crisis in case of the big crack. So imagine 300 years of constant growth and no measure created to prevent eventually at least the side effects, the negative consequences of a crisis. That's in fact where the West hit heavily and takes a while before recovering. But it doesn't go down, right? It doesn't sink. It's not like the ancient world that wasn't at all better than or more resourceful than this one, right? The Middle Ages making it into the Renaissance in that moment. The ancient world made it into the 7th century, so there is a big difference in here. It should always be considered, and once again, here we don't have enough time to digress. But generally speaking, what I would like to make you understand, even for example during the 12th century, there are people who even argue that it wasn't much of a great period of improvement, right? Of course there was, and especially at an elite level, that there were better ways of, to hierarchically control the society, that are effectively a product of civilization, not a way to impose on the people that otherwise would do whatever the heck they liked, and that is essentially killing each other all the time. But still, this would happen. The fact that endemic wars, for example, would create massive destructions, that this is a dark time in a way, right? So even though there is this dramatic growth, it's a rampant growth, but it's unrestrained. And that's why also so many important models and, systems of control are specifically created to stamp to block at least the most dramatic changes. Here, we talked a lot about the 12th century. We see what there was, for example, behind the heresies, right? It's not a way of fighting against a way of thinking, it's rather against a way of doing. And politically, militarily speaking, as well as socially, things were all intertwined. It couldn't not been otherwise. But let's say that the triumph of orthodoxy is a triumph of stabilization that probably even gave, in fact, the capacity, the system of recovering, right? I would like to stress in this video that nobody had ever seen anything like that before, right? You can't look at the ancient world, say Rome. Rome basically conquered relatively quickly this great base, and there were just a lot of centuries in which nothing happened, right? There was less kinetic energy altogether, right? They were bigger systems, so they could move more in a more centralized way. At the same time, everything was kind of slower. They had a lower potential. This thing here is something extremely violent, extremely turbulent, and it grows, and it requires new tools, new way of thinking, new way of controlling, new way to administer, to rationalize this all. This is quite important, right? Not that the ancient world in this also didn't carry out important results or comparable ones or even greater ones, of course, but still here we are in a much more balanced situation, in the sense that there is, for example, no real central power. That is something that paradoxically helps at least the local powers to develop certain local solutions. That is something that under a universal empire that actually functions as one, like the Roman Empire did differently from the Holy Roman one, for example, which is not a negative thing after all. Look at what happened, in fact, to the Byzantines at the end of the day. Even in here, big debate, because some say there was no crisis, really, the way it ended it was surely not a deterministic thing, but there is no doubt that Western Europe, for example, by the 12th century had surpassed those wars, had at least reached them, and was starting to take over, as it fundamentally happened. So this is important, especially with the acme by the 13th century. So the major stability of the farmers on the land, and the end by the 10th century of the raids and pillagings from the side of those external populations, such as the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Saracens, created the conditions for a greater security that favored naturally the growth of the population. Right? I could add about this that in spite of the second invasions during the 10th century, the 9th, most of the bases that would eventually lead to this further development were already seated, right? We're already there, right? It's difficult to say, okay, it started at one point. What we see just that is that, for example, by the 8th century, there had already been a revival, a recovery. The 10th century, the Iron Century, because of all the wars and political instability, is possibly, one actually of the most important times in this process, because it helped once again from a local base to rise and to create the precondition for all these systems to have a dialogue, to negotiate with all another, and therefore to develop something that went beyond a concept of brute force, paradoxically. Because this is also something that at a certain point happened in the path of civilization. This is no ancient world, also because we're talking about a Christian reality. We're talking about a different way of looking at life, the afterlife, violence. So it's not like before. It's more sophisticated in terms of mental categories in a way. This may surprise people, saying, but how? Middle Ages, I was told it was a moment where people were ignorant and didn't know any. Well, because you think that in the ancient world, actually, the majority of people did know something in that regard. I mean, this is not even just about knowledge, but properly the way that knowledge was delivered was, lived also in a certain dimension. Difficult topics that I don't have maybe even nor the time nor the expertise to fully address now. But the question is, we discussed it elsewhere, right here and there. We probably have to continue, but we see definitely that these are all factors that together contributed to the way Europe, Western Europe specifically, rose in these centuries. So starting from the 11th century, the European countryside knew a generalized phenomenon of widening of arable land that was the consequence and at the same time the factor of the demographic development. At the beginning, there was surely the greater request of agricultural products from the side of a growing population. This is what we see here. These are still, however, for our own standards, overwhelmingly poor times, right? There is no doubt here that the economy, especially before the 12th and 13th century, was barely above survival rates. Crop rates didn't even actually change throughout this time. There's been a bit the myth that, with the new agricultural tools and the partition of the land, there was higher crop rate. No, there is no evidence of this. There is maybe here and there, but altogether in Europe, no. Nothing really changed in that regard. It was the same thing, and the expansion here is also driven by desperation. This is something that, as Westerners, we have to come back reasoning, like after the mental pollution of the 19th century of positivism and modernism, technologism, that civilization develops, humanity advances because of pain and sufferance and nothing else, right? If you're not stimulated in that sense, you do not accomplish anything, right? There's not the progressive factor of the guy who's the genius who invents the things for which now fish and bread multiplies. Well, that was Jesus Christ, by the way. This was brutal, right? It was something that we can start seeing here, not much because of the qualitative factor, but naturally the quantitative one, but how it was managed specifically. That is also involving, quite importantly, the role of feudalism, right? The myth that feudalism stamped, economical growth. It's also another positivistic, modernistic delirium that finds, fortunately, in fact, today, no room in serious academic inquiry and standards. The reason why this system growth largely began because of the centralization of power, say, call it like this, the hierarchization, if you prefer, of power, in fact, in the Frankish world, broadly meant, where noblemen were naturally much more capable and rational and, simply intellectually developed to manage effectively this enormous amount of land they individually controlled, so that they could systematically create new markets, export in a longer range. So no, this is absolutely not true, and we could say that this is in a way also a product of feudalism in a sense. Even in this there's debate, not much because of this dynamic how we have outlined it, but specifically whether the other systems that didn't rely on that were probably more centralized in a statal administrative sense, like, I don't know, the Byzantine Empire or Islamic powers that didn't have this growth, actually could have benefited from the adoption of feudalism. This is especially a great topic in Byzantinistics, in Byzantine studies, because of, if you read, I don't know, Magdalene, these have written interesting things at the times of Manuel Comnenus and the great moment of growth before the crisis and the Fourth Crusade. But the question there was, what did Byzantine society kind of rode backwards compared to what these emperors had understood in an enlightened way that made feudalism was a response. It was more competitive, was more effective for those time standards, right? This is something that if you naturally are overloaded with negative prejudice towards the Middle Ages and how these systems work, you will probably say, nah, That's not like that. But we have to acknowledge that exactly what we call as modern is born in these countries that are exactly the ones that are born from feudalism in ways that others in the world, naturally, that is not the only factor. But in that context, if you talk about the Byzantines or even some parts of the Islamic world, especially in the Mediterranean, it's not that there were radical differences. I mean, these are still pre-industrial societies. They all work pretty much in the same way. So that difference, it's slight difference in relative terms, might have actually had given an edge to these societies. But it's surely not the only thing. History of thought is also very important in this regard, and it's not a myth, no. So given the low productivity of the land, as we've seen, the only possible response was naturally the one to extend the arable land. This is very evident in many regions of Europe that still bear the toponyms and the literally, the landscape look the way they do because of medieval changes that occurred, medieval societies at that point, those places. We're talking about colonization, sometimes the result of a collective action promoted, in fact, by those lords we were talking about before, but also by the city-states, the communal realities. We're talking about deforestation, settling on large scale that are mostly typical of Central Europe, especially east of the Elbe River. This border is important because, as you know, that's also in fact the border of the Carolingian Empire in the east. The Slavic lands had not had the same developments in a way, or at least they had, but also thanks to the Rome growth on the Rhone, actually, because they had it and it was important, but also because of the import, especially from the side of the aristocracies, that once again were the ones that led everything everywhere, from the Frankish areas, let's say. In the Netherlands, famously enough, many lands were stripped away from the sea, let's say, through the construction of dams and channels, etc. In the forestal areas of France, England, and central and southern Germany, there was a fact of intense deforestation. These areas contracted. This is important because countries like, in fact, England, France, and Germany were historically not so urbanized, especially the north of France, as, for example, southern Europe, where in a way, in this broader area, there was still a world of the forest, like literally communities that lived out there and that were cut off from the rest. For example, in countries like Italy, this since the ancient world never happened. Like every community was tied in a way or another to the city. So the extension, given that, for example, also the forests were very remunerative as well, right? For example, this broader expansion was, this transforming the uncultivated land into arable one, went through the settlement of peasant families on areas were contiguous to the fallow or in fact forested land, right? To develop at contact with let's say traditional farms, arable systems. If we study, there is also this way of measuring the agricultural activity. The analysis of pollen of certain peat bogs in Germany, we can see the diminution of portion of pollen and of beech wood and an increase of grain starting from the 9th century with an acceleration in the 12th, right? This is meaningful. And to the deforestation was accompanied naturally the construction of new villages that are still identifiable today by the suffix that characterizes certain toponyms. For example, Ham in England, Berg, Feld, Dorf in Germany. In Italy, the development of arable land interested part of the low Po Valley, starting from the intensely populated and cultivated areas that were located at the dry plains at the Alpine and Apenninic foothills. And often the cities promoted the process of colonization through the foundation of new lands. For example, the names such as Borgo Franco, that is something that you can find in German also as Freiburg, because the various names in many ways were saying these were still post-Carolingian realities. Castelfranco, Villanova, new villa, new farm in a way, or that would become even towns over time. These are all names that, if you look at, I don't know, an Italian road map, there's still everywhere in those areas, and not all the plain was bonified. However, the limits of the technical knowledge of the time, and sometimes the lack of a political coordination prevented to complete the work, right? So this is just a memento to say, look, that you don't need always climate change or other environmental situations by themselves to produce important changes. Human societies are able to really be impacting on their own, on the territories in turn, and this is a bit a way that is much more. It's just, in my opinion, a more beautiful way of looking at history, because it empowers you. It gives you a greater sense of responsibility of what politics and society fundamentally is, right? Just simply saying, it's because it's climate, right? It changes. No, it depends on you, including climate in a way, but not only, of course, even in there. But still, the differences, the serious differences you can make, are the ones that you can do at a political, social level, not even technological. That will come if the situation favors them. But within this harbor of political and social reality, without that, can't do much. This is a nice example of it. So also the contiguous areas to the major waterways and the coastal plains remained covered in swamps, ponds, and marshes. Right, in Italy, you will have to wait, I don't know, by the 18th century, and in many cases even beyond the Italian unification, so that areas like the Polesine or the Chiana Valley or Maremma or the Pontine Plain were put to arable regime fundamentally. And in the hills and low mountainous areas that were already relatively populated in the central centers of the Middle Ages, the hunger of land pushed the cultivation upwards, let's say, even on marginal terrains that were more apt to pasture and to forest, right? For example, the development of the chestnut wood was a response of the mountaineers to the insufficient cereal production, right? Was an imposing phenomenon starting from the 11th century, interested a bit all of Italy, from the Alps to the Apennine, and even up to Sicily, for example, at the Etna foothills, where the mountain soils allowed the development naturally of such plantation. And in some rural areas, as we've seen, there would be very high density of population, comprehended between 50 and 100 inhabitants per square kilometer, right? And sometimes even beyond. For example, in Tuscany, the Elsa Valley, the surroundings of Florence and Lucca, the Pistoiese hills, or also in the Lombard and Venetian high plains, and in some châtellenies of the Ile-de-France that had a particularly fat soil that, in a way, was also what dramatically favored the development of the Capetian seigneury in the area, because that's how also they began. Were just nobles like all the others, but this area specifically very, very fortunate, right, in terms of many reasons, the meeting, the crossing places of many roads and rivers, and this soil that it is very fertile. still in Italy, the revival of urban population, starting from the 10th to 11th century, is witnessed by a series of phenomena. From one side, the construction of new stone buildings, the erection of burghs out of the city walls, the building of wider city rings, and the case of Milan is one of the first in absolute terms, given that it enlarged the older ring around 880. Right, so a time actually at the end of the Carolingian of Carolingian times in Italy. So at time it wasn't even just a dramatic at the beginning of the second invasions where it wasn't particularly at the time, yet the city still had the capability. So there's also another thing we should say, that in fact we shouldn't look at the second invasions as this traumatic moment, right? Encapsulation, all this stuff is largely not due to defense from these peoples, rather for actual expansion of the local communities already at the time, right? It's controlling the territory, which naturally works both ways if you want. But even if you study from a military point of view, all these fortifications scattered all over Europe, but we know that the ones built to stop the invasions were very often secondary ones that were built, just when invasions were imminent. But the major ones were all built essentially by the local lords to rule over the surrounding countryside, where it had very few to do with the invasions in the first place. This has been very well studied, so much that, for example, certain areas, that especially the ones that had suffered the most because of these raids, actually didn't start building castles up to the end of these invasions, because they didn't have by the time enough resources because they were raided. Even in here, there are ideological reasons why some people have to deny this, because they have to say, Europe under attack and all this stuff. But actually, that's an insult to Europe, because you're overlooking one of the single most important times of expansion and redefinition of power in European history. So it's not very interesting, but nor intelligent to say the least. So in the next 2 centuries, what we've seen happening in Milan actually was carried out in many other cities of central and northern Italy. The growth of urban centers that went on up to the beginning of the 14th century in expansion terms went through very defined steps. The increase of population brought to the creation of boroughs, as we've seen outside the city walls. And naturally, as you can understand, in correspondence to the main gates, because that's how it happened. These were all immigrants from the countryside, came to live around the city, and naturally, they built their houses closer to the gates, were better defended. They had just the main road. People crossed it even for the market, if they wanted to sell something and so on. So burghs that, as you understand, were eventually incorporated within a new city ring, and for which fundamentally the new walls were built, right? Because those people began to be important for the economy, so they had to be protected. There were probably other, constructions there, activities, and so on. The majority of Italian cities built in this time, something like between 2 or 3 new city rings, right? This gives you the dimension of Italian urbanism. At this time, it naturally was by scale the greatest one in Europe. And the third one usually is built towards the end of the 13th century, and it was enough to contain in most of the cases the population up to the second half of the 19th century. This is true even for important cities like Florence, even at the time. So consider even the scale of this medieval civilization. And in fact, at the end of this expansion process of the urban area, within the last medieval gate, the space resulted even the surface covered by the city resulted to be something even 10 or 20 times more than the previous one. So, and here we're talking about Italy that was the heartland of the Roman Empire and urbanization. So the Middle Ages built something that was larger 10, 20 times more. This doesn't mean that, it's just a proportion. Medieval cities were very different from the Roman ones, right? But definitely the population as a factor was one, right? Even when people complain about hygiene or other stuff, consider that these were dramatically more populated cities, right? The Roman ones were much easier to serve in a way. But also they had other means, other conditions, right? They were literally different people that lived in here. And medieval cities were also dramatically more dynamic. They had a much greater access to resources, especially in this region. At the beginning of the 14th century, Bologna was extended on something like 400 hectares. That is thrice more than the surface reached by the 12th century and 16 times more the one comprehended within the ancient walls of the 6th century. Florence passed from 25 hectares of the early medieval city ring to the 80 of the 1172 one to the 630 of the 14th century one. Pisa was enlarged from 30 to 185 hectares, and Venice, that naturally didn't have walls because Venetian walls were the sea, and marshes. The urban expansion is marked by the increase of number of parishes that we can't count. About 6 by the end of the 8th century to about 60 at the end of the 12th. In the rest of Europe, the urban net was strengthened instead thanks to the demographic growth of the centers developed since the 9th to the 10th century, and to the foundation of new ones that often originated from those administrative, military, and commercial functions that you can understand in this world that had its own potential, as we've seen. It would in fact grow dramatically in this time from a previous lack of urbanization, largely. By the end of the 13th century, the levels of urbanization, therefore particularly high in central and northern Italy and in the Flanders. Famously enough, the Flanders are the second most urbanized area in Europe, and a bit a unicum on its own, because it's not that Germany, France, or England are reach that even in there the levels of Flanders by scale. But still, there is a greater difference actually with the Italian peninsula that is way more structured in that sense proper, right? We're talking about 30 cities that have altogether an imposing number of inhabitants. Flanders are more scattered in that way too. And this gives you a dimension of what Europe was fundamentally about. And imagine, the eastern you got, the northern you get, it's different, right? It's different. And so that there are not even proper cities. I mean, you may find city rights, but what are indicated, by the Scandinavian monarchies, those are villages. They're just trying to get, that status over other settlements around that were not very, very developed, but so that they could create their own seigneury over them. So it also depends in which terms. Then there are other important dynamics. For example, the the main commercial axis here of trade are also these major waterways, especially not just in banally from the Baltic North Sea, but mostly in the Mediterranean, but also in Central Europe, right? And there are major riverways. Look at, at cities like Cologne or Prague, right, or Vienna, right? So these are going to become something, not also for no reason. Buda and Pest too. So there is also this important role of especially the Rhine and the Danube in connecting broader parts. It will be important during the Crusades, especially the earlier ones, and so on. Then we could extend as far as Russia, that before the destruction by the Mongols in the 13th century had essentially in today's Ukraine, these major cities that had also an important middle class that after Mongol times instead will basically collapse. So that Russia goes back into not just a Tartar modeled political institutional culture, but into a dramatic privatization and seigniorialization, we could say, of their politics and society. But I hope we'll come back to talking about Russia again, because we made some videos about that today. We can expand more. So we can see, so if we had to count the major cities here, if you look at Italy first, there were fundamentally 4 major cities that we can call as true European metropolis. So the first one is Milan, with 150,000 inhabitants. Then Venice and Florence with 100,000, and then Genoa with 60,000. Then there was this other group of cities that counted between 40 to 50,000 inhabitants. There are Verona, Brescia, Cremona, Bologna, Pisa, Siena, and Palermo. So here you see they're basically all from the center and the north, except the capital of the Sicilian kingdom. That will, however, decline towards the end of the 13th century. It's just Naples that actually will start gaining held importance. In fact, there is also another, by scale, another greater number of centers of medium importance, of between 20 to 30,000 inhabitants, and then the minor cities, let's say, that there are cities proper. I mean, these are civitates. They're not burgs, towns. They're properly cities with a political body, with a city wall, with permanent building. I mean, it's an important, very also infrastructural. That's why this kind of urbanization is so important. However, just minor cities with between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants. So, of the 24 Italian cities with more than 20,000 inhabitants, only 4, as we were saying, that there are Palermo, Messina, Naples, and L'Aquila, are in the kingdom of Naples proper. Or better, Sicily. Well, here depends, because there are the Vespers, so Sicily basically is conquered by the Aragonese. But the center of the big thing is the Neapolitan kingdom, and Naples naturally and especially rises as the capital. The most important urban systems rose in the region, mostly on the Arno Basin. So we're talking about Florence, and Pisa, and so on. And then in Po Valley along the Emilia Road. So also roads, never forget these, and the previous Roman road system that still, here it's as if you had a body without blood, and you re-inject, after the early Middle Ages, you re-inject this thing to pumps hard into the major arteries, and these are still there, right? These are very clearly outlined, especially in countries like Italy, in France too, that has a very clear idea that, there are those fixed centers that are all well connected with this, every one of them at the center of an important agricultural region. Then the other important cities in Italy rose at the Alpine foothills, as we've seen if you look at Milan. Venice is not technically in foothills, but I mean it's kind of close, and also develops importantly towards the end of this period because of continental trade, especially with Germany, Bavaria. Flanders, also the second, as we've seen, most urbanized region in Europe, had these 3 main big cities that were Gand, Bruges, or Brugge if you prefer, Ghent instead of Gand, and Ypres. The population by the 13th century of this city has been calculated respectively to 65, 45, and 30,000 inhabitants. North of the Alps, only Paris surpassed the Flemish cities, right? And Paris is a capital now. But, for example, London is smaller than these cities. and or at least then of Gand, because it perhaps reached 50,000 inhabitants at this point, but we're still on a similar level. Then there were numerous smaller cities such as Ostend, Courtrai, Saint Nicolas, Douai, etc. And the presence of cities, let's say, by the way, the smaller one, were much less in the other parts of Europe. Much less. Right? Even in Spain, the major centers were fundamentally, Seville, Granada, Cordoba, but they were also in the south, far south, and in part even Granada. But actually, all of three up to the Battle of Las Navas in Muslim hands. So in England, at the beginning of the 14th century, just a small part of the English, that is between 3 and 5%, lived in centers that counted more than 1,000 inhabitants. As we've seen, London reached perhaps the 50,000, and a few cities surpassed the 10,000 souls, specifically York, Norwich, and Winchester. In France, aside from Paris, that touched and perhaps surpassed the 100,000 inhabitants, only 7-8 cities were around 30,000 inhabitants, among which were Toulouse, right in the south. It was the largest, with more than 40,000 inhabitants. Then Marseille, Bordeaux, Rouen, and Lille, right. And the important thing here is that also half of these are in the south. Rouen in Normandy, famously enough, so it did it for a while. Didn't even belong actually to, as also Bordeaux actually, but the same Marseille was part of the kingdom of Arles. Was in the French hands. Cologne was the major German city with around 40,000 inhabitants, but only 15 reached or surpassed by few also the 10,000 inhabitants. And among the centers defined cities, right, 2/3 counted less than 2,000 inhabitants. And in Northern Europe and in the Slavic countries, the urban net was even looser, and no city surpassed the 2,000 inhabitants at this point. And eventually, things will change, but still, altogether, consider what this means by scale, right? And this is a pretty good picture of how, on which axis Europe was developing, right? And what were also, if you make an easy comparison with ancient times, with the most obvious realization that there was not just an important legacy from Roman times, but also that still the most advanced areas were fundamentally the Romanized ones. But just because naturally we're the most fertile, the most populated, historically speaking, right? And don't underestimate climate here, right here. It makes a hell of a difference in a pre-industrial agricultural system if you have, for the crop rates, if you are in, in England or Sicily, right? Even more if you are in, it's difficult to find a more fertile land than Sicily, let's say in southern Spain or Scandinavia. Well, it will make an important structural difference, which makes it even more astonishing if you think the development of the North, right? Altogether, if you count the measure here, in absolute terms, as we've seen, the major growth during the Middle Ages here was in Southern Europe. But if you count in relative terms, where was the greatest growth, right? In proportionally speaking, this actually was in the North. And this is the important aspect of this story, because if you look at what was Northern Europe at the beginning of the Middle Ages, let's not even speak about it, and if you look at what it was at the end of the Middle Ages, that's where you say, wow, right? It's not that even in there, it depends also on which areas, but, the development of just England and certain Scandinavian, or just think about Germany, it's technically Central Europe, but that was imposed. I mean, there is no comparison. So those were becoming, especially Germany, for example, was together with Italy this same level of technological development by the end of the Middle Ages. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, are we kidding? Right? Germany was, lagging dramatically far behind. And so this differential, we could say, it is what we call medieval civilization, is what we should get used to in the West, to think through our history. That is, whatever happened in this millennium was something utterly astonishing that nobody ever bombarded us enough in school about, right? There's just a tiny chapter about the revival of the year 1000, the agricultural revolution, as if, this thing of the revolution is something, that was a revolution. There was no revolution. The crop rates remained the same. None of all of that. There was specifically a massive, to say the least, expansion. And this is what we have to get used to. And also in comparison with other areas, surrounding areas, there was none of that. So that's something that we have to explain as Westerners in ways that need a lot of attention, but also are deeply connected to the later developments, because you can't explain humanism or the Renaissance if you don't study the Italian communes. You can't explain the hegemonic role of France during the late modern age if you don't know what the Capetian monarchy has been. You can't understand the federal, even the 30 Years' War, the Treaty of Westphalia, if you don't understand how Germany developed its fundamentally elective monarchy in this confederacy on its own. So it's all very deeply intertwined with all what we know historically, what would be starting to be, in the Middle Ages, Europe starts to weigh consistently as such, right, in the world. But in the modern age, the world will have to cope with Europe, which is another thing. So whatever Europe got to that point, just know that it got it through this, right? And if you want to understand anything about it, you have to pass through this. And to get rid of the simplistic or primitivistic or, brutalistic, I don't know how to say that, obscurantistic, this is maybe more, views of the Middle Ages that we have been exposed to dramatically. And it makes also an important difference as Westerners to start reasoning as such, because I presume that a great impact in the way people see the Middle Ages historically worldwide are through mostly Anglo-Saxon culture that actually is very fascinated with, rightfully, by the way, with its own Middle Ages, but that also bears the perspective of Britain, specifically more of England, that had, a peculiar story on its own. I mean, I don't know, the Renaissance just arrived 50 years later in England in a way, so it's all shifted, like from that Northern European perspective that objectively arrived afterwards. So, but the rest of the Middle Ages and what we call as medieval civilization was a hell of a thing, also in other areas from before. And the idea of the Dark Ages, right? That's something that objectively, right, if you study English history, you can't even try to understand in a way, because the transition from the ancient world and Middle Ages wasn't easy there, right? But that definitely wasn't a Dark Age, not even for Britain, but for no country actually. But if you, for example, start to get used to a Mediterranean perspective, you realize there that it's very hard to even see a specific crisis or kind of dramatic shrinking or collapse of, you see actually a lot of continuity all throughout the thing, and a lot of models that are kept being emanated and pushed towards the rest of the continent. That is also through which fundamentally Europe got first Romanized, then Christianized, and that's fundamentally what's the Middle Ages about, right? Think about just the Roman Christian Empire. But the thing is not easy to tell in these terms, because it sounds as if you wanted to push certain political views or perspective, but it's not really that, right? It's exactly how we understand the Middle Ages happened in the first place today, by any historiographical standard. It's just that different countries obviously see their history in different ways. Right? There is nothing to do with that. And I mostly talk to Western Europeans because, or to those countries that emanated from Western Europe historically, because after all, as we have seen today, this chunk of the continent had, after all, a pretty common development altogether. I mean, that, how I call it, this Frankish area, right? The idea of this core heartland that you can observe in mostly today's, between France, Benelux, Germany, Italy, that eventually extended to England, to Sicily, in part, eventually to spreading in Spain, to spreading in the Danube, even conquering the Byzantine Empire. I mean, that's properly the thing that here it's interesting to observe how its center wasn't in the Mediterranean, right? When the Carolingians conquer Italy, they surely get a hell of advanced administrative structures that in the Frankish world couldn't exist, because it was just a purely private world. But as we were saying before, feudalism, that is seemingly at the center and the key, at least for the explanation of this major socio-economical development in this period, it's the Ile-de-France, it's northeastern France, it's Benelux, it's those areas that literally conquered Europe in Carolingian times, and reorganized it with these patterns that in a way homogenized the country. Right? I realized that after Brexit, you don't like to say that even England is a Frankish country after all. Of course, it's not just that, but objectively, when the Normans conquer it, it becomes it. And throughout Europe, we all start writing, thanks to the Carolingians, with the same manuscripts, with the same script, but also probably with the same manuscripts as a codicological concept of that has a Weltanschauung behind it. Right? So when you see at these veins, these arteries that we highlighted now, these demic centers, this highways, whether on water, whether on land, just look at them and you'll recognize great parts of the Europe that still exists and that has a specific structural, sedimented, consolidated nature in common, that I presume in our times we are trying to deny, for reasons that are mostly historical ignorance, but also pretty serious political problems that are not even connected. I think it's even connected with the strains between the current economical situation in Europe, right? But something that I don't know. Maybe recently I'm rediscovering a bit in the modern age as at least at the beginning of a certain trend that in the Middle Ages didn't exist as such, right? Certain part of Europe, let's say, taking a direction, another taking another, that were not necessarily actually they're not simply overlapping between. You can say it's just the colonialists, because you have both Protestants and Catholics there. You have both countries that fare better, worse today. Some that even, in fact, not even the religious division is, because you can't say that, if you take England or the Netherlands as some of the most successful economical countries, that you say, because of Protestantism. Well, so you tell me that Scotland and Hungary, that were Protestant as well, had this dramatic economical success. Well, no. So that it's not even that. But it doesn't even have to be this pattern specifically, but it has to be something more that I presume I I can't spot in the Middle Ages, because that's where you see the unitary thing. That's where you see the something that to this day has not changed. And you'd be surprised if you look at also a bit of the rest of Europe, how they're not the same grades, right? You can't think of a logical, rational mindset in certain countries that emerged out of the blue, right? After look at the Russian Revolution, or those were you can't see even in today's video, that didn't partake with the same speed, with the same structure, with the same dimension, with the same scale to this rest of Europe, and this heavily weighs today. So if in the future, of course, and hopefully these countries will also grow enough to be part of it, but it's not easy. It's not easy. Here I don't make specific names, but we can even see, if you look at fiscal dumping or certain, there are already, this integration, even in the European Union, it's more difficult than it seems, right? It's not to be given for granted, unfortunately, albeit I believe very much. For example, in the Slavic countries, I believe very much in this shared perspective, because it's a problem to me deriving mostly from mass society, and mostly the way we have educated the masses, right? Because all these misconceptions that are taking place now, as long as the elites were in charge, times were worse at the time, but those elites knew their business. They were capable of producing culture and civilization. Masses today, the freedom we have been given, and I speak here only from 1/4 of nobility, so from a good half of peasantry anyway. We were all peasant back in the day at some point, but it's the problem, right? You can't think that in 100 years, just through scholarization, through literacy, you can actually educate people to live in the 21st century with an open mind, with a functional approach to politics and society, to have a vision. No, look at what society has become now. Right? I talk with people my age, even younger or older, and we are all product of that mass society. The civic, historical awareness, the lifestyle, it's zero, right? It's as if you didn't feel these people with anything makes much sense after all. I don't know where this will get, honestly, and I'm quite worried because, as I often say, I don't see any thought even to address the problem. Because I know it sounds hard, but in fact, it's very difficult to say to 95% of the people, you're not educated enough to be reliable for my civic standards. But unfortunately, it seems to be so, and I place even myself within that 95%. I mean, I'm not making a fun. I'm not saying I'm whatever. I don't need to say I'm elite to do that. It's something that pertains to everybody, right? Because there is also a kind of cultural hegemony for which, if this takes over as the new normal, we will be swallowed into that, right? I've seen in the last generations, I would say last decades actually, for as far as I've lived, but also from people that I know that are older and so on, that there has been a sinking even just in the moral backbone, like in things that were considered important at the time, because they really were. It's not because times changed and we don't need them anymore. I mean, certain things like responsibility, like determination, like character, like firmness, like even harshness if necessary, discipline, those, we need them. Where are they? We need them at this moment more than else, because we have way more to control. How you can control so much we have without discipline? That's where these things like disasters happen, right? And that's what I'm scared by. And look at what the Middle Ages did. Look at how they fell, they found themselves into these tide that was growing, that nobody had the means and the structures to control. What did these people do? They invented those things, and they lasted for a good half of a millennium, to say at least, right? What are we producing now that will last for a millennium, right? Maybe it's just a this perspective distortion. I even want to believe it is the case, because we also have that much. We're all also being flooded by but it seems it's more impacting than before, and I fear we don't necessarily have the means to cope with it, right? And I don't know. Well, let's hope we do, actually. But let's wake up a bit about the problem, because I see no response. But whatever. There will be probably however, further hierarchization. We are still seeing that, right? The average, the middle class is being worn out. Even in the West, you can easily see it. There is no, you can't say, the countries are getting richer, but they're getting richer orderly, right? Or with kind of virtuous dynamic. No. It's getting very weird. Very weird. Common people are actually becoming poorer in relative terms to the rest of society. So it means that individually they are losing power. And I think one fundamental dynamic that made Europe the one it is this capacity to always have a community that is able to counter certain political, or to negotiate certain movements from the top. The Middle Ages are the best example of this. If we get that way, we transform ourselves in any other thing that ever existed, in terms of maybe ecumenic empire that, however, doesn't give a bit, where everybody's a subject. You believe that the emperor is just the son of the celestial deity, and it's over. In terms of individual value, responsibility, capacity, you're just a servant fundamentally, and we surely don't want that. But anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.